Welcome everyone to our next panel on international repatriation. This panel is called Developing Strategies for International Repatriation. Repatriation of ancestors and sensitive cultural items from foreign institutions occurs intermittently and generally involves few items in a few affiliated Native nations. It can be a very long and arduous process, dependent on a particular country's laws and a particular institution's policies, among many other considerations. We are all here, the Association on American Indian Affairs and our other friends and partners who have been working with us on international repatriation strategies, including our friends at the State Department and the Department of Interior, our federal partners. And we'll all discuss current strategies on moving international repatriation forward. All right, so let's get started. We're gonna just go around and introduce ourselves briefly, and then we'll get into substance. As you know, I'm Shannon O'Loughlin. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the CEO and attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs, and I'm gonna pass it to Amy.
Thank you. My name is Amy Shakespeare, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter in England. My research aims to enable more European museums to undertake repatriation. I've worked in the museum and heritage sector in the UK for over a decade, and I'm also the repatriation officer for the Museum Ethnographers Group in the UK, which is a membership charity made up of those who work with what were called ethnographic collections, either at museums, universities, or other institutions. So thank you so much for inviting me today.
Oh. We'll let the feds have their own mic.
Shannon doesn't want our cooties, I think. Good morning, everybody. My name is Samuel Kohn. I'm a member of the Crow Tribe of Montana. I serve as a senior counselor in the office of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior. Very pleased to be here. Thank you, Shannon, for the invitation. Pass it off to Martin.
Can you hear me? Okay. Hiani Washte. Good morning. My name is Martin Earing. I'm an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and culturally I'm actually Minikojin Oglala Lakota. I am a staff assistant at the Office of Tribal Justice within the Department of Justice. As you look at the conference program, we are with heavy hearts this morning as one of our colleagues, Ashley Fry from the Department of State, lost a family member, so she won't be in attendance today. I'll turn it back over to Shannon.
All right, let's look up, actually, can we just take a moment? Our friend and partner, Ashley Fry, had a loss in her very close family. If we could just take a moment and send her our support. Thank you for that. Now we've got two great people coming from different parts of the world coming to us virtually. So Martin, can you introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, Martin Schultz. Can you hear me properly?
We sure can.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for having me again and again and again. This is the 5th time, I think, that I'm at the Repatriation Conference. I am the curator for collections from North America at the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden at the moment, and here in my capacity as that. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. And Dr. Fiona Batt.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the association for asking me to present on the panel. It's a wonderful privilege. I hold a PhD in international law, focusing on ancient indigenous human remains and the law, and I've been working with Shannon, researching domestic heritage laws in Europe, with the hope of facilitating more repatriation of Native American cultural heritage back to communities. I'm also the lead of the Repatriation of Cultural Heritage Division at the University of Bristol Law School, where we're researching in relation to cultural heritage, repatriation and restitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fiona. And now we'll get started, and Amy's going to take it away first.
Thank you. I've been asked to outline some of the areas that appear to have been limitations to previous international repatriation strategies. If you've worked with European museums, some or all of this may be familiar to you, but if not, I hope it provides a snapshot of some of the main issues that have prevented more returns from happening. These may sound like a list of negatives or even excuses, but I do want to start by saying that there's a lot of movement and change happening in Europe, as my fellow panelists I'm sure will go on to describe, and there are a number of opportunities. Technical issues. So I want to give a picture of three main areas that I perceive have been holding back international repatriation efforts. No? I'll carry on talking, it can catch up with me. First of all, there is no way to enforce returns from Europe, although as my colleagues will discuss, there are some laws that govern approaches to repatriation in certain European countries. There are no laws that are comparable to NAGPRA. I know that as we've heard over the past couple of days, NAGPRA is not perfect and has its own issues with enforceability, but there isn't anything even comparable in Europe. This can also be read as a positive, as there are no limits or categories of what can be claimed in the same way as you have as NAGPRA, so there are also opportunities that come with that. There has also been a significant rise in the number of national policies and guidance documents issued, and these demonstrate that some countries are becoming more open to repatriation. But they are so new that they remain largely untested, so it remains to be seen how they might influence these countries' approaches to repatriation. And it's worth highlighting here that there are institutions that are keen to test these new policies who need repatriation claims to be able to do so. They're perhaps not able to proactively go out and conduct repatriation. However, it's also important to note that these national policies and guidance documents are also unenforceable. They're a guide to how repatriation should or could be approached by institutions in those countries, but it's up to the institutions themselves whether they choose to follow this advice and how they follow this advice. Overall, due to the lack of laws and enforced policies, there is a lack of funding and prioritization on the issue of repatriation. And this lack of funding and prioritization leads to a lack of resources and lack of capacity to undertake the work, even where there is willing amongst institutions and individuals. So they're working with untested policies, and as I'll come back to, many countries have little to no understanding or experience of working with or consulting with native nations. The second main issue is that international repatriation has generally lacked momentum. Some ancestors and items have returned home, as shown on the slide, from the UK, Finland, Sweden, and other countries, to name a few examples. And of course, these should be celebrated. But these returns are often one-offs, with one or a small number of ancestors or belongings returning home. This isn't helped by the fact that museums across Europe state that they approach repatriation on a case-by-case basis. It's not always clear what case-by-case means in practice. Some museums say that it's so they can be flexible and tailor their approach nation to nation. But unfortunately, it also seems to be used as a catch-all for saying that the policy may apply differently depending on the collection, the items, the people making the claim, the people making the decision, etc. But also, this case-by-case basis approach means that museums and native nations have been reinventing the wheel for each return, with processes being hard to replicate and having to be created anew for each claim. And this approach often adds to the already extremely long timelines for return. In this time, staff members change, politicians can change, relationships and policies can change. The returns that have happened have been reliant on nations' own research to find their ancestors and belongings in European museum collections. Some individuals in European countries have also been undertaking this research, or there have been opportune meetings or existing personal relationships. And again, this makes these approaches hard to replicate and an impenetrable system for many. Finally, I want to highlight and emphasize the lack of experience in the European museum sector when it comes to repatriation. There is a definite growing willingness and want to engage with repatriation, but there is a severe lack of skills and confidence to do so. To further complicate matters, different types of institutions and museums have different rules and procedures on decision-making and returns that must be followed. For instance, a university museum will have a different process to a national museum. Poor or incomplete catalogue information and record keeping mean that many institutions are not completely aware of what they hold in their collections, or if they are, they may have a lack of provenance that makes connecting an ancestor or belonging with their rightful home challenging. And there is also a lack of experience stateside, which has meant the federal government has missed opportunities to strategically leverage their influence and relationships with European countries to help native nations with international repatriation efforts. There are other problems that arise dependent on the country that you are working with, but that's a broad overview of the picture, and I'll now hand back to Shannon.
All right. So with all of these issues we have with international repatriation, the Association on American Indian Affairs wanted to develop a strategy that would be more effective and efficient, and also provide strong education components to move the hearts and minds of those international institutions to work with us and work towards repatriation and other types of relationships. So we wanted to develop a strategy. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what that means. So a strategy is something that you want to develop proactively and plan for, and also, of course, leave enough room for flexibility for when things don't go as planned. But a strategy is really a plan of action, that these are the steps that we're going to take to get to our particular goal. And generally, what the association is looking to do is to develop a strategy that no longer relies on this one-off type of repatriation process, where a tribe or someone finds that there's a particularly sensitive item in an institution, and then decades are spent trying to get that one item or a group of items back to one native nation. We want to do this. We want to supersize that. Let's look at it that way. And so what our strategy includes, and folks that are here behind me virtually, and Dr. Shakespeare, well, you're not a doctor yet. I can't call you Dr. Shakespeare yet. Ms. Shakespeare are working towards is creating that strategy to make this process more efficient. So let's talk about what that is. The first step that we're engaged in right now is developing country-specific strategies that are based on that country's laws, policies, institution guidance and policies, and other opportunities that we find in a particular country, because every country's laws and policies are different. There's countries like France, for example. Well, actually, I'll let Dr. Fiona Batt talk to us more about the particular countries and what some of their requirements are that we're finding out. So the first is to make sure we understand the playground, so to speak, or the forum where we're going into and where we can leverage those opportunities. And then we are working to develop a type of hierarchy so that we can point to a term or a phrase my grandmother often used, low-hanging fruit. We want to find where the low-hanging fruit is. I think she always used that saying, because she was trying to make fun of my grandfather, but that's another story. A couple of people got that joke, right? Okay. I made that specifically for those of you who laughed. Okay. So we're looking for that low-hanging fruit, those countries where it would be the easiest or the less complicated to start repatriation discussions with. Which countries have the least roadblocks? Not like we're going to find the perfect platform, but what countries have the least roadblocks, that have the most willingness to work with Native nations on building relationships and working towards repatriation. Another item on our list of things, and remember me telling you some good stuff was happening with the association, and we were likely to get an infusion of funding that is going to help us with this work. That includes this work that we're talking about right here. And another big piece that needs to happen with our repatriation, international repatriation strategies, is researching those collections in those foreign nations for geographic connections with North America in the US. And so let me specifically address this a little bit, because the association at the beginning of our journey into international repatriation that started about 2014, we were very much focused on developing a database to try to pull international institution information into one location where we could all search and have access to. Over time, we've looked at that, that plan and saw that that would really be a poor use of time. Why? Because first, developing a database like that is expensive and difficult to maintain. Secondly, these institutions that we want this information from may or may not give it to us. They have no incentive to have to provide that type of information for us. Now, we do know that some international institutions already have this information available online that we can use, and that there's other ways to research different collections in various countries, but developing a separate database from which we would pull all that information is a waste of time, because it's not an action towards repatriation. It's still just collecting information. Remember how we've been talking about NAGPRA and how people just want to research and keep looking, and oftentimes that prevents the actual work getting done because people are still looking for more data. We want to instead focus on those countries where the low-hanging fruit is and look at their collections. And with those collections, we want to develop connecting tribal coalitions in the states. So what I mean by that is that once we see an institution and see that there are geographical connections with their collections, or some type of provenance or provenience information that helps us know where are the geographical connections within the US, then we can connect those tribal coalitions. We can build a tribal coalition connected with that geography and connect them with that international institution and begin those discussions and begin those talks. So it's not just one tribe trying to leverage what they know and what they want to happen with an institution's bureaucracy. Instead, we'll have a coalition of tribes with our partners in the State Department and Department of Interior, with the association and other organizations that are working on this issue, together to leverage how we develop repatriation for that particular institution. And then what we have when we have a successful agreement and we can develop those agreements and the engagement with a particular institution, we can share that information to build momentum, to show countries and other institutions within any particular country how this work gets accomplished and how it can bring success to those institutions to better understand what their collections hold and to better understand how to educate their public about who Native nations are. So we've developed this strategy that we want to lead to, like I said, supersized repatriations and building tribal coalitions and partnerships to work with a particular institution instead of throwing it out to everyone to go find in the database what may or may not be connected with them. So I hope that's helpful in giving you just kind of a brief overview of what our strategy is. And from there, I'd like to go ahead and turn it to Dr. Fiona Batt.
Good morning again, everybody. So basically, I'm just going to give a short presentation on 4 countries that Shannon has asked me to research in relation to any laws that may possibly assist repatriation and restitution of Native American cultural heritage. So the 4 countries are France, the UK, Germany, and Switzerland. We have actually been looking at other countries, and we hope by the end of our research we would have targeted all European countries. So if we can have the first slide. So the first country is France. So the request from Shannon and the association was to look at domestic legislation, meaning the laws of a particular country. But we can't directly go into domestic legislation in these specific countries without just reflecting on international law, because a lot of laws throughout Europe and throughout the world are influenced by international law. So on each slide, I've introduced the main international heritage laws, and through our research, each country that I'm going to talk about today has signed up to the treaties on each slide. So you have the information in front of you: the UNESCO Convention, a private law convention, UNIDROIT, then we have United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So France, UK, Germany, and Switzerland have signed these international treaties, and these treaties are reflected in the domestic laws, and they act as standard setting treaties. So that's a little bit about international law. One major problem with these laws is that they're non-retroactive. That means they don't look back. And as we're all very aware, most of Native American cultural heritage was stolen, removed before these treaties came into force. So actually, they're not very effective apart from their standard setting action. However, the private international law treaty may have a lacuna, a gap that we could use, but that needs more research. So reflecting on France and the law in relation to any repatriation or restitution, in relation to France, France was initially very progressive with the initiative of the President Macron, requesting the Saar and Savoy report, which I must highlight is an amazing read and an amazing piece of work. However, it's just a report, it's not a law. But this report influenced activity in relation to legislation in France. And if you look at the slide, a law was introduced in 2022 so I wanted to say something about this law. The idea behind this law that it was that it was going to assist the Jewish community to return Jewish cultural heritage and art and artifacts that were stolen in World War II. That was part of the agenda of this law. And the second part was that it was going to assist communities in relation to requests of the return and repatriation of their ancestors. And the third part of this initiative was to assist countries that were colonized by France to help with restitution and repatriation. So the good news is, in relation to the Jewish community, that part of the agenda is law. However, as when we look at the UK, it appears definitely that the part of the law that was hoped to come to fruition is still pending in relation to the ancestors. And also the part of the law that was hoped to come into fruition is still pending in relation to colonial collections. So it appears that 2/3 of the repatriation agenda that was imagined hasn't yet happened. So at this stage, I just want to refer you to Professor Hutt's article, which highlights the fact that there's not equal protection in relation to the treatment of certain communities. So her article, the title, it says, "If Geronimo was Jewish, equal protection and the cultural heritage rights of Native Americans." And we are seeing a theme throughout Europe that some communities are being privileged more than others. So that's just one of my observations. So if we move on to the UK, one thing to comment on in relation to the UK, the laws create a very complex, I would say, broken mosaic for any community to navigate the laws in the UK would be very difficult. The UK museums, some are state-run, some are under the auspices of a university, some are charitable, and there are different laws for different types of museums. There isn't an umbrella law that covers restitution and repatriation. There's not an umbrella law that covers all museums, so it's quite complex. So if you just look at the British Museum Act, that refers to the British Museum, and there are other acts that refer to other museums. But you see, there's the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act 2009, which refers to Jewish cultural heritage. And then we come to the Charities Act 2022, which again, if you connect what I said about France, the French law was, the hope of the French law promoting repatriation and restitution hasn't been fully fulfilled with the pending parts of those laws. Now, the Charities Act 2022 was brought in to fill in the gaps. However, if you go onto the website and go through the Charities Act, there are certain articles that are pending with no date for them to come into actual law. And those pending articles would assist repatriation and restitution. So we can see a theme emerging. And just to note, there are many valuable reports since 2003 that have been produced in the UK in relation to ancient ancestors and human remains. And there's been recently a new report, but at the moment it's still difficult terrain. So that's briefly the UK. So now moving on to Germany. In Germany, there's an overarching act in relation to cultural heritage. However, again, that law is not retroactive, so it doesn't aid any community that is looking to repatriate cultural heritage from before the act was enacted. Here it's 2016, so it doesn't really help Native American communities or African communities. And you see Germany is signed up to all the international laws I pointed to at the beginning. The one significant thing to say about Germany, and from my observation, I would say at the moment it's the most positive country in relation to restitution and repatriation, only because I feel Germany is focusing on diplomacy, especially on the African continent. The president has recently visited Tanzania. He personally visited Tanzania in Africa and has made a commitment to returning human remains. Many human remains were removed, as many human remains were removed from Native American communities. So at the moment in Germany, it looks like diplomacy is the way forward in the Germans' perspective, and laws are being sidelined. There is an initiative in Germany where there's a colonial collection point, and that's the title, Colonial Collection Point, where that centre assists communities in relation to research. However, they have limited resources. So that's Germany briefly. So the last country we're talking about today is Switzerland. And again, there's just an overarching law that is, it doesn't look back, it's non-retroactive. So anything before 2003 cannot be part of restitution or repatriation of communities that suffered from colonialism or cultural heritage that was taken from Native American communities. However, Switzerland has entered into many bilateral agreements. So it has an agreement with, for example, Colombia, a South American country, Egypt, an African country, Peru, Mexico. So these bilateral agreements enable foreign governments to negotiate the return of cultural heritage. However, my research shows that the US hasn't signed any bilateral agreements with Switzerland. So getting to the strategy, there's a term in law or a phrase, strategic litigation. So I'm just going to read a little bit about strategic litigation. Strategic litigation, including strategic human rights litigation, should not be ruled out. So this is still part of using domestic European laws to try and build a case to bring back larger, I won't say pieces of cultural heritage, but as Shannon said, not just one-off requests, trying to build a case, a strategy to target a particular country and bring back maybe a whole collection of Native American cultural heritage. So I've put here, it has been used effectively in relation to the protection of cultural heritage of Indigenous people. Strategic human rights litigation in Africa has been well used in relation to land rights. Globally, it's been used in relation to climate change. So strategic litigation enables the telling of the story, the framing of the narrative of the theft of cultural heritage in the voice of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and can be very powerful in judicial and extrajudicial settings. So with all the information and the laws in Europe, the hope is to build a strategy, find a case or find a collection in Europe that can tell the whole story for Native American communities. And as Duffy says in her work, strategic human rights litigation or strategic litigation actually causes a ripple effect. And I think that's what Shannon's hoping to achieve, that one big case or targeting a whole collection would actually affect in a larger way restitution and repatriation of many other collections, Native American collections. So in summary, I just wanted to talk about access to justice. So looking at laws is an attempt to enable Native American communities to access justice and enhance the rule of law. And I strongly believe non-return, we basically talk about cultural heritage not being returned, but we don't focus enough on the delay. And I think the problem with looking at all these laws in relation to European countries and the suspension of laws that we were hoping that were coming into fruition, that this further delays Native American communities accessing their cultural heritage, and ultimately doesn't fulfill the rule of law that many European countries quite often refer to. So thank you very much. I may have gone over time and I apologize for that.
Thank you, Fiona. And I know that was, there's a lot of laws, and I myself am not a lawyer, so I know that it can be extremely overwhelming, and trying to understand not only the laws, but the policies and the guidance documents that I talked about earlier. I come at this from kind of a museums background, and so we can probably talk about the kind of different ways to approach it in a bit, but I want to highlight a couple of tools, online tools and resources that can help you understand the European museum landscape. The first you may have come across, and that is the Restoring Ancestral Connections website. That's a collaborative initiative supported by the association, which has a list of museum partners, accompanied by an information page for each partner institution that provides general information about the museum, its collections, resources, opportunities, and pertinent contact information. And then a couple of months ago, I launched a new website called Routes to Return, which aims to open up global networks and share information to enable international repatriation. And this was very much inspired by the fact that I could see projects and initiatives happening in Europe that were not reaching those who could use the information. It's very much a work in progress. It's not perfect. It's constantly being updated and added to. And I would really welcome any feedback that anyone might have. I'm grateful to a number of my European colleagues who contributed to the first resource on the site, which is called Understanding the European Museum Landscape. It has a page that outlines the purpose of the resource and an overview of the European landscape with some terms to know, common themes, common approaches. And then the resource itself, as you can see when it loops back around, enables you to click country to country to see an at-a-glance bullet point list of that country, whether they're open to claims at the moment, what laws and policies they have, and things to be aware of. And then the rest of the page goes into detail on what those laws, policies, and guidance documents are, how the country is approaching the issue of repatriation, and where possible, how to search collections at certain institutions. I've tried to focus on the countries and institutions that are open to claims and where it might be best to approach at the moment. I've built up a good network across Europe from doing this work, and I'm really happy to facilitate putting people in touch. If you're looking for someone or something, or if you just want to start looking at international repatriation or something that you might want to do in the future, I have some contact cards with me which have the website address and also how to get in touch with me. I'm really happy to help where I can, and I'm working with Shannon to see how we might merge this resource with Restoring Ancestral Connections, and ensure that all of the information is easy to find and use. So from pulling together this research, there's just one more. Yeah. From pulling together this resource, I just want to sum up a couple of things that I've observed as someone who's relatively new to this work. As mentioned, there are some good initiatives, funding, and people to work with, but this information often doesn't reach those who need it. It's been noted by my European colleagues that they're not sure who to get in touch with, and it would be great to know how they can better understand different nations and how to contact them. Secondly, as Fiona touched upon, there is a large focus on African returns at the moment, partly due to the Savoy report that she talked about from 2018, but also led by the push to return Benin bronzes, and because the African diaspora in Europe and African governments have been pushing for returns. So although the role of the embassy and the diplomatic route to repatriation is different for each country and often unclear, there does seem to be scope for the US government to put pressure on European countries to prioritise repatriation. Many countries are keen to maintain their relationship with the US, and repatriation could be seen as a form of diplomatic goodwill. There is also somewhat of a competition within European countries, both internally and with each other, to be the first institution to return or the one to return the most. And there are governments that want to look good on an international stage. So therefore, looking at how native nations can harness these two aspects of national vanity that nations have when it comes to repatriation has the potential to create action. Plus, if we look at the impact of French President Macron's statements on African repatriation, a statement or even mention from someone like President Biden, for example, could go a long way to getting Europe's attention, but perhaps that's kind of stating the obvious. Finally, many museum professionals have fears around competing claims or returning to the wrong nation. Many of the same fears that I'm hearing were seen not only prior to NAGPRA here, but also are still being seen in institutions today. This to me indicates that there are learnings from the US, positive and negative, that can be taken and shared with European colleagues. But overall, these fears and willingness to do this work also reflect the huge amount of change that is happening and the growing number of opportunities there are to pursue international repatriation. And I'll now hand over to Martin to talk about some of those.
Thank you. I try to keep it rather short, and I'm always available for questions, of course, outside the conference. What I wanted to start with is mentioning that Fiona said that the president of Germany said that human remains will be returned to Tanzania. Well, the president of Germany has the same problem that you all have. He first needs to locate them because there is no central register for all that. And he does not have access to private museums. He does not have access to state museums, really, just the National Museum. So the different levels, the different forms of ownership for museum are important, the different ways that these institutions process the collections that they care for, all that needs to be taken into account when doing the work that you are all doing. But there is, of course, there's a lot of hope and everything is moving and in a very good direction. So it's not that there are only problems. There's a lot of opportunities. And one is what you see here, the Heidelberg Statement. Already published in 2019, but I guess that the smallest number of you will ever have seen that before. It's a statement by the directors of ethnographic museums in the German-speaking countries, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, that says, all the signatories below are committed to the following principles, and the first one is, right, to take care that all those who are related to the collections due to their history and cultural practices will, if at all possible, be informed about the places where collections relating to them are held. I guess that was not possible so far because I doubt that any of you have ever heard from any of them, but there are all the big museums in that list. So the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, which has 30,000 inventory numbers, around 30,000 inventory numbers from North America. That's by far the largest collection from North America. Hamburg is in there, Cologne is in there, Zurich, 2 museums in Zurich. 3 of them, Berlin, the North American Native Museum in Zurich, and the museum in Hamburg, have presented at this conference in the past. So you have to hold these people accountable. And that is what this agreement is for. Can we get the next slide? Thank you. And there are different ways of holding them accountable. This is not even Europe. This is Israel, the National Museum in Jerusalem. They have a quite substantial collection from North America. But as you can see on the left-hand side, it says gift and of Faith Dorian and Martin Wright, New York, to American Friends of the Israel Museum. So if this is not owned by the Israel Museum, if this is owned by the Friends, and you can see they are based in New York, that's on the right-hand side, then that changes everything for you. Just and that is something that Wendy Teeter said yesterday, go to the institutions that fund these museums, like the Ford Foundation, in this case, the American Friends of the Israel Museum. But in this case, if the collection is still owned by the Friends, and that's an institution from the United States, there should be a lot easier access for you. That should change everything for you. That might even bring NAFRA into the consideration here. So there are different ways of approaching all that. And then one comes what we saw on the first slide, that it's all a question of money. If we go to the next slide, that has also been mentioned, there is money. And if you team up with a German institution, with a German museum, they can apply for money from the German Lost Art Foundation. So you don't have to apply for money, they can. And you just have to find the institution in Germany, and that doesn't have to be a museum. You can have private partners, you can have university partners, but they can do research at the museums for you, and that can be financed by that German Lost Art Foundation. You can report missing ancestors, missing objects to them. If you know that they are somewhere in Germany, you don't have to know where they are. That way, word gets out and the research can be done. So there are different ways to do that. Some museums have their databases online. Some museums have them partially online. Every country basically in Europe has a museum foundation that you can approach to get more information, and you can reach out to them to ask about databases, about publications that might list inventories. Switzerland in the 1980s published 2 volumes on the ethnographic collections that are kept in Swiss museums. And that's a very detailed book or 2 volumes in German and French and Italian, the national languages, listing even the small museums. It's not super detailed, but it gives you a lot of information that is very valuable. When it comes to Sweden, I've presented that several times before, but we do have a database online. And this time I decided to try to show a bit more transparency than I've done before. And I hope it's not offensive in any way, but if we go to the next slide, which is also my last one, that is human remains that we have from North America at the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden. And I listed that by state and the number. We usually don't have more specific information because most of these ancestors came as exchanges. They were not collected in the field by people from Sweden. They came as exchanges with institutions in the United States and Canada, but these are still here. And as you see, the last line is Hawaii. No ancestors, because all of them have been repatriated. So these things do happen. You just have to approach us, because we as a state museum cannot even take that decision. We cannot decide we repatriate. We can go to the government here in Sweden and say we want to repatriate that because there is a claim, but the government decides. So we need you to come to us to claim these ancestors, and then we can go that next step together with you. And that is my presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Martin. We're going to move to our federal partners now. Are you ready? Have you been waiting long enough?
I wouldn't say waiting, but I do note, Shannon, you put us between all of our attendees and lunch, which is a precarious place to be. So we'll do our best to be brief and thoughtful. So once again, my name is Samuel Kohn. I'm here from the office, the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. As we all know, today's panel is talking about developing strategies for international repatriation, and we've heard some really excellent tips about the international pieces of that. I want to briefly refocus us to a domestic effort and component related to that, and that is the Safeguarding Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act of 2022. For those unfamiliar, the United States Congress passed last year and President Biden signed into law the STOP Act. The STOP Act has a couple of most notable pieces, most significantly prohibiting the export of Native American cultural items, archaeological resources, and objects of patrimony. The STOP Act accomplishes that goal in a couple of ways. First and foremost, it makes it a federal crime to export or attempt to export such items without certification. It directs the affected agencies to create a mechanism for the United States government to issue a certification for export, and it creates an exemption from the Freedom of Information Act for information that Indian tribes share with the United States government in order to facilitate issuance of an export certification. The STOP Act also increased penalties for violation of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and it also created a Native working group which will advise on implementation of the STOP Act going forward. At present, 4 affected agencies, that's the Department of the Interior, the Department of State, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security, are in collaboration drafting regulations to implement the STOP Act. For those unaware, we completed a round of consultation this summer from about May until the end of August, with a number of listening sessions to solicit broad feedback on what should be included in the STOP Act regulations, what sort of agreements would be helpful between agencies, and where the office should be situated within the Department of the Interior. We're currently deep in the drafting process, and I welcome any thoughts or feedback that folks have to offer today as we continue to move through that process. But I do want to draw attention to one important piece. Even though the STOP Act regulations, by nature of the jurisdiction available to the United States and our ability to enforce federal crime, they are exclusively domestically focused. They may meet the requirements set forth in the UNESCO Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer and of ownership of cultural property. And I say that because I'm sure those in the room may be aware of one tribe in particular who pursued a court case in another country and ran into a bit of difficulty seeking to vindicate their rights under that convention because of the absence of any laws or regulations in effect in the United States that would fulfill pieces of that convention. So happy to receive any feedback or guidance on that regulatory process, but that's about all I've got to say for the moment, Shannon. I'll pass it to Martin.
Thanks, Sam. I'm domestic Martin. International Martin's virtual. So, I'm here to speak about the government agency collaborative work we do regarding international repatriation. As Sam had said, the Department of Interior, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice work on this effort. We also have IMLS and NMAI that contribute with their advisory roles. First and foremost, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the Citizen Potawatomi Nation for their gracious hosting of the annual AA IA Repatriation Conference this year. The other morning I woke up and gave thanks to a beautiful sunrise on the horizon, nature's ombre, if you will. Some years ago, I actually worked at the National Museum of American Indian, and we hosted the Citizen Potawatomi Nation for an exhibit titled Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations. NMAI established a partnership with the National Archives where actual treaties were installed in the exhibit on a regular basis. In the spring of 2018, we hosted the Citizen Potawatomi Nation's 1836 treaty installation within the museum. On Tuesday morning, it was a joy to see and hear Vice Chairwoman Capps give welcoming remarks. She's a kind and thoughtful individual. As we installed each treaty, each tribal delegation brought their respective cultural protocols to Washington, D.C. It was quite the sight to see and to hear many tribes as they brought life into the exhibit with their songs and prayers. Needless to say, it is one of the most proudest projects I've been able to work on in my quasi-federal and federal career so far. As an Indigenous person myself, both my treaties have been on display at NMAI, the Treaty of Horse Creek and the Fort Laramie Treaty. It was a surreal experience as I never thought I would see my actual treaties on display during my museum career, much less my lifetime. I was able to cross-culturally relate to other tribal delegates and members who found recognizable names of ancestors' names on the actual treaties themselves. As we all know, Natives have been a part of diplomacy and public policy for hundreds of years. So what I do for my current job at the Department of Justice, I help Ashley as we serve as co-chairs for the White House Council on Native American Affairs, International Indigenous Issues Committee, the International Repatriation Subcommittee, and Sam's a part of that as well. And over the past year and some change, we have been working with 5 international museum professionals from the United Kingdom, Germany, Finland, and New Zealand. And one thing that we're working on this year is we're creating international networks with Amy and her colleagues, and we're working to draft a basic research document for our international partners should they begin their repatriation process with tribes. And we're looking to circulate this document in the near future for tribal input. Other good workings that we do, earlier this summer, we hosted the United Auburn Band Indian Community. It was very good to see Melody McAdams, as their Tribal Historic Preservation Office, actually educated us about the repatriation checklist. So I know Shannon said yesterday that should be sending out to a group. It is an excellent resource. So if you get a chance, please spread those good writings far so that everybody reads that, because like the United Auburn Band Indian Community really put a lot of effort into that. And then finally, part of our outreach too is Shannon hosted us with the Tribal Partners Working Group this past summer, where we shared our good workings that we've been working on, and we're truly appreciative to that. So that is all I have to say, and thank you.
Thank you for your patience. So we had a lot to say, and you know that this is a really complicated and complex area in repatriation because we don't have a law that we can complain about. Everything is created from scratch, and so we're all working together to try to build kind of repetitive structures to do this work within. We're open for questions now. We'd love to hear from everyone, either virtually or in person here. You can come up to the mics and ask your question. Thank you.
Good morning. My Tlingit name is Cheyenne. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Tlingit and Haida Tribes of Alaska. My question will be specific to Martin Schultz. Heida and tack for all your work. That's Heida, hello in Swedish, and thank you in Swedish. Martin, all I can say is I am gobsmacked when I see a chieftain's headdress gifted to a country whose citizens are victims of genocide and oppression, being gifted this Tlingit chief's headdress to them. I cannot fathom any Tlingit clan chief freely giving something of that significance. We are a matrilineal culture. Our chiefs or our heads of clan are the caretakers of our ceremonial regalia, but they do it on behalf of the house or the clan or the tribe. It is not something that it is theirs to own and give away, so I'm really shocked. Also, I wanted to let you know that I will be in touch with you regarding our Alaska Native relatives that are possibly in your capacity. And we do have a representative of one of the Aleutian tribes that I'll be talking with and reaching out to you in the near future. Gunishtish, which is in Tlingit, for your work and your honesty and transparency to all of the board, all of those participating in this. But as I said, I am shocked, I'm gobsmacked, and I'm highly questioning the provenance of that chieftain's headdress. Again, thank you.
Thanks for that. Can I quickly respond? Is that okay, Shannon? Do we have time?
That's what I was going to say. Did you want to respond? And hi, yeah. I miss you.
Hi. Next year I'm back in person, and then we have more time to talk, but I keep it short. I'm aware of these problems, and we have, I think, around 800 objects from the Northwest Coast that we call objects. The largest part being from one collection that was gathered during a trip in 1892, 1893. That was collected with the help of the infamous Jacobsen brothers. That also brought more than, I think, several thousand objects to the Ethnographic Museum in Berlin. So there's an even much bigger collection from the Northwest Coast in Berlin, which doesn't make ours better. But yes, just do get in touch, and I'm happy to help facilitate.
We have a question here in the chat that just bumped. Okay, I'm sorry. So if memory serves, the law of equity has never been addressed during any of the AAIA repatriation conferences. Equity was not invented in the US, but it was adopted by US courts and used to be a separate area of the law. Also, equity used to be taught as a separate course at law schools. Is equity dead? I don't believe it is. If it is not dead, is it relevant to law both in the US and abroad? And if so, how do we apply the law of equity to cultural heritage?
That's, I think, the subject of multiple law review articles and perhaps even a separate course. I will say, as I understand, and by way of background, I am a trained attorney and spent a year working for a judge in Montana. But I understand equity in the United States judicial system to be primarily a remedy that courts utilize as part of their inherent powers. So to do my best to answer that question in very succinct fashion, I think equity is not dead, but it is certainly restricted in its use to the judgment of the court before which it's called into question.
Thank you. I knew you'd be able to say it better than I would. It's kind of judge's discretion in finding a remedy. And it's also a very theoretical question, and I like to look at these issues in more practical questions and issues of diplomacy and negotiation and how we best work with one another to achieve the goals of all sides. And so I think when we talk about these issues, we first have to talk about just our relationships with people before we even talk about what we think the courts may or may not do, or how they may be successful or not. And maybe at some time, Dr. Batt can talk a little bit more about litigation strategy, because I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea that we're going to be out suing anybody. But there's strength in being able to produce litigation type arguments when you're working with institutions to help leverage the situation and negotiate the outcome that you're trying to achieve.
Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Thank you all for everything that you've done and continue to do, and your presentations just now. I want to just kind of like speak to some things that I also then obviously want all of your inputs on. One of the first ones being going to non-domestic Martin, so international Martin. I recently presented this summer at the American Indian Workshop in Budapest, Hungary, Budapest, and wow, I have a lot of issues, and I suggest any Native person in this room with the bandwidth to go one day. They're not always in Hungary. They rotate, but it's a group of scholars, European scholars, essentially studying us. And this year was the first time there was more than 2 Indigenous people at the conference to share how we felt about being studied. But I say this all because one conversation that kept coming up in presentations that was utterly disturbing was the Indian hobbyists of Eastern Europe and the ongoing, like, more than just your average pretend Indian conversation, but full-blown powwows of thousands of like Czech or Ukrainians just dressed as us in regalia that they've bought from places, and people who are on deathbeds who are those grave robbers and things like that. What do we do about that? Because even in terms of domestic realities where you have someone with 200 acres of land in Montana that finds a bunch of things and they don't say anything, NAGPRA doesn't really work for those situations, it feels like, or at least we haven't discussed them at this conference so far. And then I also want to talk about the hugest European elephant in the room that was once in France and is now in Rome, the Vatican. Those wampum belts, those catacombs. That's my statement. And then my next one being in regards to domestic realities and the STOP Act, that retroactive reality. Harvard was one of those institutions moment before the STOP Act was passed that was like, oh, well, let's gift stuff overseas and then it'll be harder for them to get, but we can still benefit from the research. What do we do with that? Because that is continual genocide, that is continually moving us further away from Turtle Island for the purposes of saying we're extinct. And then as an environmental person, the ecocide knowledge that comes out of some of these things, thinking about where there are, whether it be bear claws, whether it be buckskin regalia, whether it be seeds that are a part of rattles or what have you, most of those are extinct for the places that people were originally. Most of those tell deeper stories when we think about issues of climate change. And so I'm curious where that does or doesn't fall into your work or your daily thoughts, and I'm sure you have a lot of daily thoughts as we all do in this work. But yeah, thank you.
Martin, can you take that first part?
Yeah. So this hobbyist movement is a big issue here all over Europe, basically. It's not only Eastern Europe. And these people, they make their own regalia. So it's not older stuff that they wear that they bought in North America. They are the ones quilling and beading, not being initiated in any quill worker society or anything. So there are several issues with that. And I don't go to these American Indian workshops. I did in the past, but that's long ago. So I don't really know what's happening there now. And I've never been to any of these hobbyist meetings, but they are still happening. And even here in Scandinavia, and all that we can do as museums is try to educate, and together with you. because it's also not on us to say this is all wrong. And it's not on us to say, you say this is wrong. We have to do that together with you. So that's my approach. That's how I try to do it. It's the same with the term Indian that has been criticized here in Sweden a lot. People from Sweden say you're not allowed to use that, but then they are speaking on your behalf. So there are several things, there are several issues with all that. When it comes to environment, we do have archaeological collections. We have huge archaeological collections from Greenland that we try to work on with Greenland that can tell us stories about the past and the present, and that can help us understand maybe ways into the future. Environment, endangered species, distribution of certain species over time, all those topics are important to us as a museum too. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, yes, we have a question.
I just wanted to come on the in response to the Vatican comment, because yeah, it is a big a big elephant in the room. I have a separate page on the Routes to Return site for the Vatican, because it's kind of its own smallest, I can't think what they call it, it's not country but smallest, you probably know, can't remember the term, but recently they returned a small part of Parthenon marble to Greece, so they actually have conducted a repatriation, albeit to another European country. But also they host their collections manager, I think it was, there was a webinar, and Jackie Swift from NMAI was on there speaking about repatriation and talking about the future of these issues at the Vatican. So I see that, you know, they have a lot and it's not going to be overnight, but it makes me hopeful that they're engaging in the conversation, because Italy, you know, which it's situated within, aren't engaging in the conversation. So I don't think change is going to happen quickly, but compared to some other places, they have at least kind of started to engage in the conversation, and I hope that we can push them more to carry that on.
Yeah, and I love your question, and I just want to reemphasize that that's why we're talking about building a strategy that's effective, and a plan to go into those countries, not just to educate the museum folks and the government folks, but to also educate the public, just like what we're doing here in the United States. I had flipped through the channels last night on TV, and I saw some public station of some kind doing a Native Heritage Month video that was beautiful. This nice little PSA just recognizing Native American Heritage Month in the U.S. I mean, this is to me, this is amazing, that there is more and more recognition in the United States that indigenous people still exist. So I know there's hope for also in other countries and educating people in an appropriate way and in a manner that people in this room and out there in video land want to see happen. And I wanted to turn, before we go to another question, because I know the State Department and Interior are doing more of this work by pulling tribes and museums together with some funding for research, and I'm wondering if you all can talk a little bit more about that and how that's helping to educate. No, nobody.
I think I'd say, Shannon, I'll take that in two parts. You know, we're doing a number of exchange programs and sort of fostering those discussions in a very interpersonal way, because a lot of times, for when you're talking about international relationships and emails flying back and forth, it can be hard for people to remember the human element behind all of this. And we found that in addition to legal obligations and at its core doing the right thing, the personal pieces are super influential and super persuasive. So I'd say that's been, in my opinion, the most significant piece of that. I want to detour for just a second to talk, to try and answer your point about the STOP Act and applying to transfers that have happened, because I know that there have been a number of stories about NAGPRA and large institution collections in the news as of late, and to some degree reference to those transfers that have happened, right? So anything that happened after the STOP Act went into effect last December, I think would be of interest to the department and our folks who are working this up. But, you know, in terms of exporting those things, we simply don't have those regulations in place yet. We're working as quickly as we can, and we hope to meet the statutory deadline of December of this year, but without the regulations in place, the law is not fully implemented as of yet.
Okay. Okay. I'm on this one. I'm just gonna say. I also wanted to add on to that there's a lot of comments in here about community engagement and the benefit of that. I also wanted to just mention those of you guys who knew that we had presented last year on our own case in Northern Ireland. The elders at the conference sat down and talked to me afterwards about ways that we can work around institutions when they're not willing to work with us, and that's what we've been doing. So my husband and I, he's a Cherokee National Treasure for Cherokee Nation, obviously. He's a storyteller. We've been working with the community to help them understand who we are, what we are, and what that means. And so when you hit that roadblock, I just want to give you hope that you can keep working on things while the rest of the laws are working. Veronica Passfield asked, do I hear our European allies saying that test cases would help establish precedent legally and within the museum field in Europe? This is a motivating idea for me, despite the overwhelming workload of repatriation in the US, and that time is importune right now, and she has that in a question mark. Thank you.
Fiona, that sounds like for you.
Yes, Shannon. I'm not thinking like you, necessarily using that word suing. It's not, I'm not thinking of an adversarial approach when I talk about strategic litigation or strategic human rights litigation. I'm talking about finding a potential case, but when I use that word case, I don't mean necessarily in the courts. I'm not sure what fora we could bring such a case, or even when we're talking to a museum, we could maybe be a little bit more effective if we used, you know, some legal language. I know diplomacy is important, but if we're talking about strategies, and yes, I may be coming from a legal perspective, but sometimes I feel that we need to have a legal strategy as well. And yes, I mentioned that especially strategic human rights litigation has been it's had a really positive effect in relation to land rights in Africa. In the African Commission and the African Court, and those cases have actually been built on the story told by Indigenous peoples in actually Kenya, and the law has been woven into the story, and in one way you wouldn't even, you notice the story more than you notice the law, and I think that's what's quite clever. So I'm wondering how we can do that. I don't have the answer. Yet.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to come back to that to say that in the research for the Roots to Return website, what I heard consistently from curators was we need claims. We need claims. I think Martin and I kind of are agreeing, International Martin, are agreed on that. That's going to have to be your new name now. So, yeah, because as Martin mentioned in his presentation, sometimes the museums aren't allowed to go out and proactively approach nations, but they are allowed to respond to claims. And so where there are repatriation policies, where there are guidance, where there are things to draw upon and make claims, I know that that's not easy to kind of to find ancestors and belongings to be able to make the claims, and I'm hoping that's something that we can address with the strategy. But imagine if they had like an influx of claims, and then they would have to start to pay attention, and I think that's really what Shannon and the rest of us are kind of looking at with the new strategy, is putting that pressure on and saying, these are all the claims, you've got to start, you know, addressing them and paying attention. And there are people that want that and that need that to be able to push for change within their own institutions. So
okay, let me test this. I had two questions, but I'm going to ask one because lunch is sitting right there. It looks like, and this is for Amy. Recently, I was able to join you on a panel for the UK, and there was a large amount of museums and institutions who were eager. They had great questions, wanting to, you know, work with the tribal nations. And then in this discussion and looking at the bilateral agreements that are nation to nation, I think my question is, for those of us who are still early learners in international repatriation, are there any countries out there that, while the group that you hosted were eager to meet with the tribes on a sovereign nation basis, what about the countries, or do you know of any countries that are just doing the bilateral agreements where it is nation to nation, where we may have to involve part of the White House Council efforts when they included the State Department? And that was just one of my questions for you. If you knew of any countries outside of that we are aware of that may not work with the tribes individually.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and I wrote some notes because I thought someone might ask me that. First of all, I want to say, in terms of, again, going to the new strategy, I know I keep talking about it, but I'm really excited about it, is that education and raising awareness of sovereignty and the importance of recognition of sovereignty. It's not something that's talked about enough in Europe, in my experience, and it's really important to start doing that work, to understand why it is important to work directly with nations. The new law, so some countries that are unfortunately talking still in the kind of nation state to nation state vein, is the new laws that Fiona mentioned with France. They talk about nation state to nation state. They haven't been tested. Whether it will apply in that way, I think remains to be seen, and Fiona might be able to come in on that. The Austrian government have guidelines on repatriation, so not laws, but they advise working nation state to nation state, again, largely untested. Other countries like Belgium and the Netherlands are only returning to what they class as their ex-colonies. So if they played a role in the colonization of a nation, that wouldn't necessarily count, if you see what I mean. So that's also something to consider. Belgium specifically excludes working with communities within nation states that are in their ex-colonies. So that's a very uninclusive policy. And then there are some specific museums that I know of that require kind of what they call endorsement from a national government. I know that possibly that might come up this afternoon, because I know that National Museums Scotland have that within their policy, and that's a way of them trying to work around being a national museum and some of the loopholes that they have to jump through. So they require a national government endorsement. So John, who's speaking this afternoon from Scotland, might be able to talk to that more, but it is worth being aware of.
I think the only thing I'd add is, in terms of those formal government diplomatic channels and getting engaged with Department of State or with the United States writ large, that will, it's very different asking from within the United States, where your line of inquiry can be to any agency, but often is to Department of the Interior and our office and the Assistant Secretary or our NAGPRA team in the National Park Service. But when we start to look internationally, all diplomatic related communications flow through the Department of State. So it really is very much an all of government approach, I would say, and Ashley is fantastic in that regard. She is super able to navigate the procedures and policies of the Department of State that I think nobody else is very familiar with. So I would say in terms of having those discussions, engage broadly and often within the different branches of the United States that have equities or interests, or with whom you have a relationship.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, just to make clear that out of, I think there's 15 countries on the website so far, and those like couple that I listed are the only ones that require you to go nation state to nation state, and sometimes involving the federal government may be seen as quite a sort of intense approach that makes museums fearful to kind of engage for fear of kind of reputational issues. So where you can work kind of as a nation with an institution, and where you don't have to go through nation state or federal government, is worth being aware of as well, if that makes sense.
No questions on Zoom? Any other questions here? I have a board member trying to call me right in the middle of my panel. Should I get it? No. Don't be mad, Frank. Okay. If no one has any other questions, let me just say I really want to thank Martin and Dr. Fiona Batt for joining us in their different time zones today. And I want to ask just quickly if either one of you have any final words that you want to share. Martin?
Fiona?
Yeah.
Me? Okay.
Or Dr. Yeah, either one.
Ladies first.
I just want to say thank you. It's been very interesting, and maybe I see the biggest challenge to be that all conversations, even if you're communicating with a museum, eventually it has to be state to state. When I say it has to be, that seems to be the trend. And I don't know how you can break that trend, and maybe Amy and Martin and the other participants have some ideas of how you can break the trend of state to state negotiations. Thank you.
And thanks again also from my side. And you can always approach us, each of you. And it's not only nation to nation, it's also private property, it's family heirlooms. There are different reasons for repatriation, and there are different ways of approaching that. But there's one way to approach us. Just send us an email or give us a call. And that's the fastest way. We, as a national museum, as I said before, have to involve the government. We cannot take the decision to repatriate, but it is the fastest way to approach us directly. And after this panel, I will hop back to the other online participation. So I will be one of the lurkers, and there you can also reach me in the chat. If you are participating online too, you can just hit me up in the chat, ask more questions, discuss things, whatever. I'm there. Thank you.
We'll just offer another round of thank yous to AAIA as well as Citizen Potawatomi. It's a pleasure to be out here, happy to see a lot of faces. I think still grateful to every conference we're able to be at in person after the pandemic. So grateful to have time together.
Yakoki, thank you all for being a part of this panel, and we hope this has been helpful for you.